The Ion Center for Violence Prevention, formerly known as the Women's Crisis Center, is currently working on kicking off our prevention, which is the Green Dot Bystander Violence Prevention Program in Warsaw, which I know that you're pretty familiar with. So thank you for supporting us. And we are even more excited to share that we're writing our Department of Justice grant for the second time.
Okay.
Stacey?
Yeah.
Tell us some more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So we did change our name from Women's Crisis Center to the Ion Center. There's a couple reasons we changed it. Shalayne, please feel free to pop in.
Thank you.
We're really proud of the work that we did as Women's Crisis Center. We've been an agency for over 40 years. But again, we knew that having women in our title made it inaccessible to some populations. The word crisis is maybe not a word that people want to identify with. Or going back to what you're talking about, like the community perception, crisis can mean different things. So we knew we wanted to change our name from Women's Crisis Center. So that's when we changed it to ION. We originally talked about it being like changing a negative to a positive.
Okay.
But what we also realized is that ION kept popping up in all of the work that we do. So things like protection, compassion, pet protection, prevention, inclusion. Like ION just kept popping up in everything we do. So it kind of felt like a no-brainer. Like that's what we do. That's who we are. We wanted to be really intentional to also include the ION Center for Violence Prevention because we really want to live out our mission, which is to take the best care of people who's been impacted by power-based personal violence, but also work to measurably reduce it. And so that violence prevention piece felt really important because we're doing those both parts of our mission. And so when we're talking about prevention, there's actually 3 forms of prevention: primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention. Do you want to talk about the river, Shalayne? Or do you want me to take it? Or
If you wouldn't mind,
okay.
I will read this.
It's okay. And so we use this beautiful metaphor of the river when we talk about how do we prevent violence. And so pretend like you're walking along the river and you look in and, oh my gosh, there's children in the river. How do we help these children in the river? So you're getting them out of the river, and that's what we call secondary prevention. They're in the river, they're in the throes of it, but how do you remove them? So how do you prevent it from getting worse, right? That's secondary prevention. Primary prevention is somebody's like, hey, why are children getting in the river to begin with? How do we prevent them from getting in the river? So maybe you go up the bank and, oh my gosh, the bridge is broken. How do we fix the bridge so they're not in the river? So you're preventing the kids from getting in the river in the first place. That's primary prevention. And then there's a third form called tertiary, which is the children have been in the river, they've been pulled out, but now we're going to maybe dress up some wounds.
I was going to say, dry them off and dress their wounds.
Yes, there you go. See, you know it. Because you want to prevent it from getting worse, the harm of being in the river from getting worse. So knowing these 3 forms of prevention, the primary, secondary, and tertiary, we actually put all of our services through that lens. So that primary prevention, that green dot, how do we empower our communities to help prevent those moments of harm from happening in the first place? We do it in high schools, middle schools, communities, and colleges. And then we have tertiary or secondary, which is when somebody comes to Shalayne and is like, Shalayne, I need help. And they're going to make a safety plan to prevent further acts of violence from happening. There might have already been some acts of violence, but how do we stop further acts of violence? And then we have tertiary. We have like our therapy or our support groups where it's how do we process what happened and not let that trauma make things harder for us. And so we're so intentional about putting that violence prevention in our name. It was a little bit of a shift internally thinking about like violence prevention. I think about our emergency shelter. Our staff was like, we're not preventing violence. They're here because they're experiencing violence. And so we talk about how because they're in our shelter, because these individuals and families have fled to our shelter, that's one less night in an abusive home. And is that one less violent night? And does that count as violence prevention? So we're really proud of that shift in our language around our services.
Could you explain a little bit to me then a little bit about what Green Dot is about?
Oh, absolutely. So that's a great question. I'm glad you asked because I was planning on bringing it up. So Green Dot is, again, the Green Dot Bystander Violence Prevention Program. It's a mouthful, but it is very exciting. So this program was created at the University of UK. and it's a nationally recognized program, and it statistically helps reduce call volume for our dispatch and our law enforcement. So we are empowering bystanders in the community with safe tools to intervene should they see violence or hate, to where they can try to de-escalate that situation should they choose to. What is the slogan? Not everyone has to do everything, but everyone can do something. And we realize everyone has their own tolerance or barriers that they hit up against. So we really try to work with them to find what their comfort level is and where they can try to de-escalate if they see situations. And it could be as simple as, so there's something going on in the parking lot. Maybe you set your panic alarm off and cause a distraction to disperse that fight or whatever is happening out there. So this is a community-based program right now. So we're starting out with the government and law enforcement, and those will be the people that will be invited to this upcoming kickoff. And then we're hoping to expand and branch out for the duration of 2023. I don't want to give too many details because I know that you're going to have some guests on this show coming in the next couple weeks. So I don't want to give away all the magic.
But so this is relatively new, though, in this area. And so, so it's exciting, and that you're working on that, and so it sounds like if I'm wrapping my head around it, is that you're kind of creating an awareness of how you can be involved, but also it's not telling you to get in the middle of it. It's giving you tools, like you said, to be able to help, but to make a difference.
And so once you successfully go through the program, you're not required or responsible to do anything. There's no caveat. You're not a 24-hour safe space that takes people in. It's just letting the community know that violence will not be tolerated in any aspect, and we're just trying to get people involved to create culture change.
And so I guess it makes sense it kind of came out of the University of Kentucky. I would suppose that maybe in a college scene, after hours, you're stressed, maybe a lot going on, bars, drinking, all that kind of stuff of where it kind of picks up. So it kind of makes
nailed it.
Yeah, so it kind of makes sense on a little bit on that.
It goes back to that of you were talking about how we really look at evaluation and like are things working. And so Dr. Dorothy, I can't speak now either.
It's catchy.
Yeah, Dr. Dorothy Edwards, she's the one who created Green Dot. She birthed Green Dot. So she had been working what's called the VIP, Violence Intervention and Prevention Center at University of Kentucky, and she very passionate about this work, and year after year after year was doing violence prevention programming, right? And they were doing evaluations, and they were getting feedback like, yeah, it was very engaging, it was great, like we loved it. But at the end of the day, at the end of the year, were they actually reducing violence? And unfortunately the answer was they were not. And so she actually took a couple years back and was just like, took a couple years off and sat back and like, we're not doing what we're intending to do. So what do we do? Right. And so she went to the research. Makes sense. She works at a college, very academic based. And looked at like, how have people moved the needle on important things? So she's researching, how do we get people to start wearing seatbelts? How do we get people to stop smoking? How did we like put a dent in the HIV like epidemic? And so really went to that research piece, and that's where this bystander intervention piece came out.
That's and so you said this started at the University of Kentucky, this training. I assume the goal is all 120 counties in Kentucky, and that's ultimately where they want to go?
We would love that.
Okay, so I mean it's a lofty, but it starts.
Yes, you have to have the manpower for it. But yeah, absolutely, we would love for Kentucky to be a leader in violence prevention. We actually have our first Green Dot city in all the United States in Kentucky, in Maysville, Kentucky. And so we want to work hard to make it the second city is also in Kentucky.
We can do that.
We can.
It's the advantage of being small. Gosh darn it, we can do this. We're I guess this is just kind of asking trends. Where do you see like some trends going in what you all do in this? It's community based and all the things that can impact it. We're always thinking that if here at the library, what's going to impact the library and what, how do things come along? What are some kind of trends and things that you've all noticed just in the last few years?
I feel like the big one that we're having, St. Elizabeth is taking the lead on this, but it really intersects this work. Is there's actually a huge increase in strangulations, non-fatal strangulation, and the impact that it has on the victim's body. And a lot of times people will, when they're strangled, they're like, I survived this, I'm okay, but there's actually like lasting implications. That it has more of a long-term effect on the body. So what does that look like? And then there's also a lot of research and studies around perpetrators that are willing to strangle or actually very like escalated, and it's a lot of it's an indicator that there's more violence that's going to happen. The way they describe it is that it's like the alcohol on the breath. And so there's a lot of just scary information around non-fatal strangulation, and that there's a lot of push around. A lot of laws are being pushed around like how it's being classified as felony and misdemeanors, and a lot of education around that right now. I think that's probably the biggest trend that I'd like to highlight.
That's immediately what I've thought of when you asked that. And I do agree with you, Stacey. I think that there's a lot more awareness coming that strangulation is now a felony punishable crime. It takes around the amount of pressure to open a can of soda to black someone out, and then after a few more seconds, you're looking at attempted murder. So there is a lot more education around it, and the more people that are starting to understand and be aware that the pressure is on around strangulation now, a lot more people are starting to report. And so we're working really closely with St. Elizabeth and trying to bring these strangulation trainings to our law enforcement, to our leaders in the community, so we can get that word out there that just because there's not physical marks initially when someone is strangled, they can still have health repercussions for up to a year later. And it can be extremely detrimental and terrifying.
So what is causing the, I don't know, increase is the right word? I mean, is it just better reporting now, or is it
awareness?
Okay. So it's just kind of, it is not always happened, but you know what I'm saying? It just wouldn't have been reported in the past, and now it's more an awareness on that of what's going on.
Awareness and more reportings of it. Absolutely.
In which we know statistically, looking at power-based personal violence, it's underreported anyways. And so I think that's why we're starting to see the uptick, is because there's more conversations that we're having even on just like this level around violence and how to decrease it. And the same goes for power-based personal violence as a whole. You know, I have found personally, just being in this position for the past 2.5 years, is there's a huge lack of education around what intimate partner violence or power-based personal violence can actually look like. It's not just the physical aspect of someone being beat or stricken. It's also emotional, using children, using financial, economic abuse. There's a whole power and control wheel of dynamics that people are undergoing. And a lot of people don't realize that they are being abused just because they're not being physically hurt.
So what, and I think you just kind of did, but what is a good example or good definition of power-based violence then? Because, you know, like I said, you've mentioned it a lot, but what do you mean when you say that?
So power-based personal violence is rooted in the assertion of exactly what it says, power over another person. So if anyone is more or less oppressing someone else through these different means, then that's power-based personal violence. And we focus importantly on intimate partner violence, so any type of dating or sexual or marriage relationship. And I don't know if I answered your question.
I believe you did.
And I think important thing to mention too, it could be real power or perceived power. So that real power could be maybe at work, where a supervisor might be sexually violating a staff or intimidating a staff member, or it could be like, so it's like actual power or perceived, like in a relationship. We use the term power-based personal violence because previously as a movement, we've used the language violence against women. And while we know that partner violence and sexual violence, we can typically get a picture of a woman, what we know is that men can experience domestic or power-based personal violence, intimate partner violence, sexual violence, just as likely as a woman would. It doesn't discriminate on gender, right? And so we wanted to move that language away from violence against women, so then it was more to remove that stigma that it only happens to women and make it feel more accessible for men, right? So
I was just going to say that aligns with what our mission is, to take the best possible care of people that are being impacted by power-based personal violence, and that also aligns with why we rebranded from the Women's Crisis Center to the ION Center for Violence Prevention, so that we can include all walks of life that are experiencing this.
So you are very good at getting together and processing kind of your own data, like, hey, this happened, how do we act on this in the future?
Yes.
How do people find you? How do people contact you? How do they reach out? And I guess I'm talking people in need. Yeah. I mean, how do they know, I guess?
So we have a lot of people that come to us from a quick Google search,
okay.
But honestly, I would say word of mouth. And we've been really intentional about trying to hang up our tear-off flyers in every possible bathroom or outlet that we can, just trying to get the word out there that we are here. There are resources for you because, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of times people don't know where to start.
Right.
But I know Google's been a really good asset in getting us resources near you.
I'm going to brag on sorry.
Oh, I was just going to kind of throw this in because I was reading something where, and of course I'll get the age group wrong. Let's say under 20. What is that? Gen Y. I can't keep track.
Keep it. Yeah.
Younger than me. Okay, younger than me. But that over 40% of them get their information off TikTok now. Over Google searches.
That is good to know.
Which I thought, because I being an old, am not on TikTok, and I couldn't imagine that being a source of information. But I'm like, but anyway, so I think that's really interesting too, though. And I guess, I suppose there's a lot going on. You don't have a time to sit down and do a survey. Well, how did you find us today?
Yeah.
But I just thought that was kind of interesting, like thinking that. But then when you say word of mouth,
we do get a lot of referrals.
Yeah, that's what I was going to mention is we've tried to be really intentional. But I think Shalayne's being humble here, but she does such a fantastic job of knowing how hard it is to disclose that you're experiencing sexual power-based personal violence. And so she's done such a good job building relationships of who are victims most likely disclosing to, that then can say, it's not, let's call the Ion Center. They absolutely could, but it's more of, let's call Shalayne. We know someone who can help you with that. And I think that personal piece makes a big difference because it is so hard to disclose. It's such a personal experience.
Yeah, having a point of contact with a name attached probably is a lot
like
easier.
A warm handoff.
Yeah, as you go through that and knowing there's a name and not just it's not like saying let's call a caseworker or like it just nothing against that position. Just just doesn't have that. It just doesn't have that warmth to it and stuff like that.
Well, so I think one thing that
no, what do you got? No, keep going. This is good.
So one thing so going back to, like we mentioned, we wrote this grant that we had Shalayne here for 3 years. Is it 3 years? 2 years?
2.5. Yeah, 3 in October.
Yes. So we had 4 goals. We wanted to increase victim access. So to services. So we got a whole new advocate for the rural counties at Shalayne. We wanted to increase access to safe housing. What we found is that we have 2 emergency shelters that are undisclosed. So individuals or families who are fleeing from intimate partner violence have a safe place to flee to. We have one in Campbell County, which we found was, again, not accessible for clients.
Right. Yeah, that's a hall.
And so it's a hall, and then also people can be if you're from the rural counties, urban setting can be very intimidating. And so just not want to be there. Or if you're away from your support system, if your job or your kids' schools are here, that can be really difficult too. Right. So increase that support for victim survivors here. Do prevention in 2 cities, Warsaw being one. And then also, and I'll kick it to Shalayne for this, was to form what we call a coordinated community response team, or CCRT. Do you want to?
Yeah, so the CCRT team's been really good for getting the word out there, awareness, and then also bringing together our leaders and community influencers in the community to figure out what other barriers we're experiencing, what direction do we need to go in, and then also looking at larger scale for policy change. And it's been extremely insightful. It's been great to see people come and share their voice at the table and really just work together as a community. It's going to change a little bit in the future, hopefully, with this new grant coming in. We're going to have a more, a greater focus on sexual assault and how we can work together as a community to make access to services better and feel like I'm forgetting something. Those we do meet quarterly, and we also have a newsletter that goes out in between our quarterly virtual meetings. That's been extremely helpful. Stacey does a phenomenal job writing it. It's a lot. So if you want to be a spotlight, we'll be happy to showcase you on our next coming months of our newsletter.
Very cool.
Sound interesting?
Of course.
Our next, I want to call it live because we do it over Zoom. Is in May. I don't have the date
May
on top of my head.
1st. It's the first Monday of May at 1.
Yes.
I think it's the 1st.
That'd be the 1st.
Perfect.
Yes.
You got it, girl. But we have a guest speaker who does a phenomenal training on substance use.
Okay.
I've seen the training twice, and every time I learn something new, and it's
agreed.
His passion is just like radiating from this. So we would love if anyone listening would want to attend this training. We'd love to have you.
Please reach out to me. I'd be happy to send you the info. And if you have any suggestions for future meetings, please let us know. We'd be happy to include them as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, guys. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Talking to you. This is a wonderful conversation.